Right, so this is a card that everyone has been constantly asking me to test, the RX550, and these are oddly expensive. This cost me around £35–36, and that's considered a good deal. Well, not so much a good deal so much as an average deal. That is what people are paying for this. It's about the best price I was able to get one for. Occasionally they'll come up cheaper, but I'm sure we'll get into pricing later. But why don't we open this up and just double check what we've got? Because the RX550 is a bit of a weird card. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's because everything's gone up in price, that this has seen a resurgence in popularity. But people are constantly asking me about them. We have another box inside. I can't show you the top because they've left someone else's address on there. And in here is, well, the RX550. I've never really used one because the RX580 and the RX480, the cards you actually wanted, got so cheap that these were almost redundant. But yeah, you do get apparently 4 gigs of RAM with them. This is the 4GB model. I don't know if they made any smaller ones. But let's get this plugged in, install some drivers and see what all the fuss is about. Because to me this looks like, well, a rather expensive display adapter. So given how heavily requested this is as a topic, we are going to see how far this will go if it's tuned, probably do some Linux testing as well, and just find out why these are selling in their droves, because why wouldn't you just buy an RX480 or RX580 for the same price? I know they've got more expensive, but if you're following auctions like people are on these, why wouldn't you just buy the better card? I suppose it doesn't need a 6-pin. I am guessing they sold some of these with a 6-pin though, given the traces that are left on the PCB, which would really be a redundant card. Then again, I suppose you can whack this in any system, so we'll find out if this does actually work. I know nothing about these at all. I remember them being launched, but we'll find out. So there we go, it's codename Lexa. It came out in 2017, so it's a 9-year-old card now, and people are spending money on it. I know it was sort of the spiritual successor to the 750 Ti to some people, because, well, no need for a 6-pin, whereas on the 1050s and the 1050 Ti's, a lot of them do come asking for a 6-pin. And drivers are still the same ones from the start of the year. That makes sense. These are on quarterly updates, but at least you are getting a degree of support from them. And we will run it through 3D Mark real quick, get a baseline score, see if there's any tweaking or advantages to be done. I am curious to do some power efficiency testing. I'm not lying about the price. People are spending good money on these. To the stage where, if you actually go through and see what they're selling for, you've got ones that have sold £32, £48, £40, £37, £42, £36, £31 in box seems to be about the best deal. But look, even these really low-end looking display adapter ones, people are spending about 40 quid on. These are really in demand right now. So occasionally people are getting a deal, but most people buying them are spending about 40 quid on them. Someone here spent 56 quid on the same model that we've actually bought. Who knows? Is there something we don't know? I mean, I've never tested one. I don't even know what the specs are. So the specs are about where I'd imagine they would be. Released in 2017, 16 ROPs, 32 TMUs, 512 shaders isn't bad, and 4 gigs of RAM. In many ways, it's sort of like a modern 750, and maybe that is why it's popular, because, well, it's a card that can go in any system, and if the specs are as good as they say they are, I mean, we've got enough RAM for modern titles, but does it have enough power to do anything with it? I suppose we'll find out. I mean, you do get DirectX 12, you get modern drivers, you should be able to tweak it around a little bit. Bit of an interesting one, isn't it? Very weird. Well, we're going to go through and get a baseline score of how the RX550's doing, because, I mean, it's got enough to be an entry-level graphics card. I'm just amazed at the price for it, because in my mind what you'd do is you'd buy an RX580 or RX480, and as we've seen in my videos, you can just undervolt them to about 50 to 60 watts of power by literally just dragging a couple of sliders. And sure, you need a 6-pin, but at that point you could just use like a Molex adapter. So if this can come close to that level of performance without needing any of the tweaking, then I suppose it's got some appeal. And I mean, we can overclock it as far as it can go, because let's be honest, it's on a PCIe lane. It's never going to be asking for that much power, even overclocked. And performance is mediocre. I mean, it's not exactly terrible, but for 40 quid, you can do a lot better than this already. I mean, maybe it is just really bad out of the box in standard RX 500 series fashion. Maybe I'm being too pessimistic, but the way I'm seeing this, it's not looking great. But still, we'll find out all the real facts and figures later. For now, we'll just get some results and then try and tweak it around till it's actually better. I mean, that's about an average score, to be honest. That does appear to be how the RX550 performs. I mean, it doesn't get warm at all. How hot does it actually get? 35 degrees. I'd imagine the bulk of this video is just going to be straight up benchmarking, but I am going to see if there is any tweaking that can be done. By stock settings, it uses 25 watts. I mean, not terrible performance. If we increase the power limit, how power limited is it? It hasn't changed at all. Okay, so it's not power limited, even with its stock settings. Can it do 1250? For a brief second it can. Right, I'm going to see what works out stable on here, and then we'll check back in with an overclock once I can figure out just how overclockable an RX550 is. So it would appear, after an hour spent dabbling around with this, that Power Color and a lot of the lower end variants, which is mostly what you see that aren't OEM ones, are genuinely terrible cards when it comes to the actual silicon on there. This one was able to achieve about 15 MHz extra on core clocks, and about 50 MHz extra on memory. I've tried dabbling with voltages, I've tried dabbling with power limits, I've tried dabbling with just about everything, and it simply doesn't have the hardware to go much further than this. I was expecting something like the R7250 or the HD7750, where, you know what, even on the lower end ones, you can get some decent clock speed increases out of them, but here, nothing. So I'm happy that is at least stable. It's taken a long time to get to that point. Oh, it's died again. I guess you just have to run it with a power limit increase because it can't do anything. I don't even know what I can do because it crashes with everything. Right, after monitoring voltages, bits and pieces like that, I have found the tiniest way to get a bit of extra headroom out of these RX550s. What you need to do, set all custom tuning. The VRAM will not budge on this one. So what you're going to do is bring up all of your controls for voltages and clocks and everything. We are going to take 75 millivolts off the memory and apply that change. We are going to drop to 1000 across the board here. After doing that, we should be able to run 1250 stable. We also want to increase our power limit to 75%. And then, I kid you not, this has been stable for a hot minute. Well, that's about all I can say about it. Undervolting it helps it stay more stable, but really, even with an undervolt, we could eke out an extra 15 megahertz before it will black screen. So yeah, after 2 hours experimenting and tweaking around with the RX550, just increase the power limit. If you've got one of these cheaper ones, there's really no headroom. So whatever performance you see in this video is what you're gonna get if you buy one of these. And I think that's about all the tweaking and setup we can do. So what was the RX550 and why is everyone asking me to look at it? Well, it launched in 2017, being a new addition to the RX lineup. Previously, the lowest end card you could buy was the RX460, a card we've looked at. But the idea for this one was to offer something even more budget, and they were cheap cards at the time, and from what I remember and what I found online, they sold for around £50 or $70. So pretty much like a modern day R7250 or HD7750. You know, those sort of easy low-end AMD cards you could whack into any system, and it would give you a few media features and sort of just transform any system into an entry-level gaming PC. And they did okay, but even on launch, most reviewers noted that this is a 720p card for most modern titles, and 1080p was already proving a struggle. And also, for not much more money, you could go for an Nvidia option like the older 750 Ti or the newer at the time GTX 1050, both of which would likely perform far better. Now, fortunately for AMD, given that most people were clamoring to get a hold of the Nvidia equivalent, it left these RX550 cards quite readily available. So OEMs use lots of them, which is why tons of the ones you'll see on the market are the very bare bones basic OEM cards, and because of this, there's lots of low profile ones easily available, whereas for the 1050 and the 750 Ti, well, good luck trying to find one that's not a rip-off. But still, it was a card that pretty much did its job. It was a slightly more powerful display adapter with a bit more going for it than, say, something like a GT 1030. So it's nothing amazing, but it did its job. Specifications wise, and the RX550 is sort of exactly what you'd expect it to be. It's based on GCN4 being the Lexa Pro variant of Polaris, which makes it a 14nm card. Most variants you find on the market do actually come with a rather substantial 4GB of GDDR5 memory through an actually somewhat decent 128-bit memory bus. I know usually this would be a criticism, but you've got to remember this is quite a low-end card, so it has a decent chunk of memory bandwidth. You do still get quarterly driver updates, these are just bug fixes and a couple of optimizations, and you get 512 cores, 32 TMUs, and 16 ROPs. You do have full DirectX 12 and Vulkan support, and surprisingly, the RX550 is not actually the worst Polaris card they made. They did make an RX540. That is a card that exists, and I will review one eventually, but it sells for virtually the same price this does at the moment, so it's not yet found its niche. So the RX550 is a bit of a weird card because you are getting okay specifications, but you'd think maybe £10 for one of these, maybe 15 quid, but no, these are dead sought after right now, costing £30 to £50 and pretty much the same price all over the world. In fact, it costs the same money to buy one on eBay UK as it does to import one from AliExpress. The big thing is though, on a lot of these lower end AMD cards, well, tweaking them always netted you a sizable performance increase, and whether you want to say the RX550 is set up perfectly out of the box, or whether they realised they could really cheap out on these aftermarket offerings, well, that's up to you, because my RX550 does not budge. With an overclock and an undervolt, the maximum stable I was able to achieve was an extra 15 MHz, we achieved an extra 12 points in 3D Mark's time spy. So there is virtually no point trying to overclock them, just increase the power limit to make them a bit more stable. Now, according to rumours, this is because the OEMs think your Dell, HP, Lenovo's, they got the best silicon available, but then it's a catch-22, because those ones also have the worst coolers available to them, so can't really overclock because of the cooling. Then you get these variants like Power Color, MSI, and even some of the Sapphire ones, where it's the spare silicon that was left over, with decent coolers, some that actually look quite nice, but the silicon is such low quality that you're pretty much going to be running it with its stock specifications. When we look at the progression of the RX550 throughout the 3D Mark synthetic benchmarks, we can see that in DirectX 10, so older titles, this thing is a bit of a powerhouse for what it actually is. In DirectX 11 with Firestrike, it's doing okay. Towards the DirectX 12 era, which is when this card released, and it's doing passably. That's about all it was ever designed to do, with 1295 in Time Spy, and still Nomad Lite, which is quite reminiscent of some of those more well-optimized DirectX 12 titles still coming out today, 1021. Pushing it into the realities of 2026 with Steel Nomad, and we scored 130, which was likely a lack of power and also a lack of VRAM. But what does all this mean when we throw it up into a comparison chart? And it's not exactly great. Generally, in a synthetic test, this card performs worse than AMD's Vega 7. Now, the Vega 7 was set up very well in a mini PC with fast RAM, but it's not exactly a great showing for the RX550. When you consider the 750 Ti, which is very much a sort of similar card to this, scores around 500, 600 points more with an overclock, and even the RX460 scores about the same, you can understand why a lot of people at the time were saying, just buy the 460, it costs about the same price. So yeah, in the synthetic testing, the RX550 doesn't exactly have a great deal to offer. As great as synthetic testing is, there are of course other factors at play here, such as the fact the RX550 does contain 4GB of decent RAM, and it also has really good support for modern APIs that Maxwell, in the form of the 750 Ti, is certainly beginning to lack, and we looked at it probably a couple of months ago now, and I was very blown away by how it was doing, but its lack of support in modern APIs was certainly showing its limitations. So maybe the RX550 has something to give. No, it's not exactly the most powerful card in the world, it never intended to be, but at the same time, for £30 to £40, if this is something that you are considering just to whack into your computer, is it offering passable enough performance? Because, well, let's be honest, my thoughts already are just buy an RX480 and undervolt it down to 50 watts, boom, that's good enough. But the RX550 does have the advantage that it will work in power-limited BIOSes. You think about the really bad Lenovo and HP ones that say, oh, more than 30 watts, that can't go in here. Well, for a lot of people, the RX550 is one of the best cards that you can quite easily get a hold of that will go in there and will transform it into a gaming PC of sorts. But the thing is, for £30 to £40, it is a steep price to ask for what it is, so is it actually any good when we throw it up into the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with very high settings in 1080p, with the settings that it actually decided to go into using, which was very high across the board. And to be fair, I immediately thought this was too much for the RX550, but I thought, you know what, if this is how the game thinks it should run, we'll give it a chance. and it did return 30 FPS on average, but with those 1% lows, it was all too common for you to see under 30 FPS when there was foliage or just too much happening on screen. The real solution was to drop back to the high preset, which contains a mixture of high and very high settings, and keep the same 1080p resolution. We were now able to achieve 37 FPS with 1% lows down to 33 FPS, which overall felt a lot more controllable and a lot more playable. Given the card's lack of power, if you wanted to see 60 FPS, you're better off dropping the resolution than you are settings, and that is something you can do. Moving over into the world of GTA Online, and we did see the performance went up with the same high presets, returning now 41 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 36 FPS. The reason for this? GTA Online Enhanced Edition is actually relatively well optimized, and there's less happening online than there is in single player, so the card has less to do. So for GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, the card nails it without any problems. Just as a reminder of how this card played GTA 5 Legacy Edition, which, to be fair, when this card came out was the version of GTA 5 that people were playing. Now, this is utilising DirectX 11, which honestly is not something that Polaris deals with great. It's okay with it, but it's nothing spectacular, and we returned 35 FPS on average with a mixture of high and very high settings and AMD CHS shadows, which once again is how the game decided it wanted to run, and I can't really fault it for choosing these settings because it runs at about 30ish FPS in 1080p, which is not a bad experience for a card you can just drop in your computer. For a card that cost about 40 quid, not great, but at the same time, for a card that you can drop in any system, not a terrible result. Moving over to GTA Online Legacy with the exact same settings, and we did see our frame rate now struggling with around 31 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 26 FPS. You could resolve this by dropping to the settings or the resolution, but at the same time, if you look at the utilization of the card in the top left, you'll realize this isn't the fault of the card or the drivers, this is simply how GTA Online Legacy runs, and it struggles to utilize even cards like this. But what about modern competitive shooters? Well, Counter-Strike 2 is always the sort of go-to benchmark here, and with competitive settings, which is low everything and dynamic shadows, which apparently is how the pros are playing these days, in a 1080p resolution we returned 116 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 87 FPS, which really isn't a terrible result and is decently competitive for a little card. Does it compare at all to the RX480 and RX580 that you should probably get instead? No, not really, but if you do drop back to the popular widescreen, well, not really widescreen, 4x3 stretched resolution of 1280x960, our average did go up to a slightly more competitive 156 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 109 FPS, which was pretty decent. The thing is though, this is one of those cards where those newer and intensive maps will certainly make a dent in your frame rate. Simulating a competitive map on the latest release of the Cache map, we now drop down to 92 FPS on average, with 1% lows just north of 60 FPS, which was playable and was controllable, but in standard Polaris fashion, it would take a few minutes for the frame rate to stabilise, and even then, this isn't exactly great compared to other cards in the price range. Now, Arc Raiders was the first time I went, okay, I can kinda see why the RX550 might be a little bit sought after, because compared to those other cards we were talking about, like the 750 Ti, this card does deal with FSR even better. That's not to say Maxwell doesn't deal with it, because it does, we've done a video on it and it actually worked pretty well, but given we've got 4GB of VRAM here, it's not enough to handle higher settings, but it is enough to at least handle and assist with the overhead of running FSR. So Arc Raiders running with low settings in 900p with FSR set to balanced mode returned us 36 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 30 FPS, which honestly looked pretty great and ran pretty well as well for a card you can whack into any system. Is it exactly a mind-blowing experience? Definitely not, but does show that FSR can help out in some of these newer titles, which is something I wasn't expecting from the 550. If you were interested in playing without anti-aliasing, well, you can drop it down to 720p and it'll achieve virtually the same frame rate, just it'll look a bit jaggy in places because you will need a lower resolution. Next up, I can already see some people complaining about this, saying this is the RX550, this isn't designed for Cyberpunk. Yes, I get that, but at the same time, cards in this price range can play Cyberpunk, and they can play it pretty well with nice settings. So if you're spending this level of money, what kind of performance are you going to get here? Well, with low settings in 1080p with FSR set to its balance mode, it was unplayable even in the benchmark, returning 23 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 18 FPS. However, if we drop this back to say 720p with FSR also set to balance mode, we return 37 FPS throughout the built-in benchmark and 31 FPS as 1% lows, which would indicate the game is playable. And when you're actually just engaging in general gameplay, the game does hover around 30 FPS with these settings. It is controllable, it doesn't look particularly fantastic, but it is sort of on par with a 750 Ti here, probably a little bit more stable than that, which if you went off the synthetic graphs alone, you probably wouldn't believe. The problem is though, it is still an RX550, it is still a low-end card, and the moment there's anything hectic going on, well, the game is now a sub 30 FPS experience. You could utilise my very low settings config here to probably bring it back to playability. You've certainly got the VRAM for it, you just lack the power. And the thing is though, it's just one of them games where it was never designed for the RX550, and with the magic of FSR, it nearly makes it playable until there's too much going on. Always a popular one here with BeamNG, and when running the jungle map, which is one of the more intensive areas of the game, especially for these cards with lots of draw calls going on, just how did it run? Well, we ran the game with low and medium settings, but we did require a 900p resolution. 900p is sort of the sweet spot for these games that are quite intensive on the card but still run decently well. We returned 34 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 29 FPS, and one thing that will surprise quite a few people, or probably not surprise them depending on how you're looking at this card, adding in extra cars and bits and pieces like that wouldn't change the performance. You have 4GB of VRAM, which is too overkill for the power this card actually has, which means when you start adding in extra assets and bits and pieces like that, well, the card actually has the VRAM to deal with it, so you can push this quite far, you're just limited on settings and resolution. So BeamNG, decently successful, just when you compare it to the 1080p High and Ultra you'd be getting on other cards in this price range, it doesn't look too great. A new addition to the benchmarks now with S&Box. S&Box. I don't know how you're actually meant to pronounce it. I'm going to go with S&Box because that is the English pronunciation of that title. In low settings in 720p, it ran awfully. It ran at 23 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 14 FPS. Originally I was going to treat this benchmark a little bit like running Gary's mod or something, given it is the spiritual successor, and I'm sure with updates and time this will become more optimized, but already I'm considering doing a low VRAM challenge to see if we can actually fix the performance of this title, because honestly, for the visuals on display, I thought the RX550 would be able to handle this. But what you are seeing now is using up all 4 gigs of VRAM, keeping the card at 100% utilization, and giving us a sub 30 FPS frame rate. So I'm not too sure whether to blame the game here, because it shouldn't run like this. I'm fairly sure this is Source 2, and it should work better. And 2, yeah, I need to look into how performance on this game works. So if that's something you're interested in, please do let me know. Now, I can see one big use of this graphics card being to whack into a standard office or desktop PC with, say, a Skylake i5 or a Haswell i7, something like that. Boom, you've got a gaming computer. And if you just wanted to play things like Fortnite, well, with DirectX 12 performance mode in 1080p, I have absolutely zero complaints. It ran at 65 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 57 FPS. Honestly, the frame times here were remarkably solid. I'm gonna guess it's because of that overbuilt amount of VRAM, and the fact that we're running the game with such low settings that if there ever is a spike in usage, well, we simply have the hardware to deal with it. In fact, this is one of the smoothest experiences I've had with Fortnite on these lower end cards, and I'd say just cap it at 60 FPS and enjoy. You're getting a 1080p resolution, most people that are playing this competitively are using the performance presets, so there's no real issues. In fact, I was actually playing the game relatively well, and I'm not a Fortnite player, so Fortnite, no problems for the RX550, just you're not going to be targeting 144 or 240 FPS on this entry-level piece of hardware. People have been asking me when Baldurs Gate 3 can return as a benchmark, and I'm done re-downloading it and reinstalling it, and here, given this is an AMD card and the Vulkan render mode doesn't work, Performance was lackluster to say the least. Low settings in 720p was pretty much a must, although the game was controllable given this is turn-based combat. Most of the time would average around 30 FPS, with not exactly great frame times down to 21 FPS, and this is something that is very common on even new AMD cards. I've not tested the latest Radeon 9000 series and things like that because no one sends me graphics cards, so it just depends on when I can afford them. At the same time though, here on the RX550 you can just about eke out a 30 FPS experience, but this is going to be what you're going to be expected to achieve. It's not going to be a smooth 30 FPS because you're running an AMD card. I've heard things are better on Linux given it's running through Proton, but yeah, Baldurs Gate 3 on an entry-level Radeon, not exactly fantastic. To do a complete 180 on that result, we have M&B Bannerlord, which as we've seen, it doesn't matter whether you're running Intel, AMD, Nvidia, this game almost always seems to know what settings it wants to run at. I don't know whether the devs have got the most comprehensive hardware config that matches up perfect settings, but it defaulted to a mixture of low and medium settings in 1080p on an RX550, and we returned 49 FPS with 1% lows down to 36 FPS throughout the built-in benchmark. Now this is reminiscent of the late game, and it is worth noting one of the low settings it did use was a low battle size, so the card is never having to deal with a huge battle. I think it tops out at 350 people at one time, but that is still a very good experience. So M&B Bannerlord is completely playable on the RX550 with no problems whatsoever, and you can even enjoy a full HD resolution, so credit to the developers, it does run pretty good here. One of the best additions to PUBG that they've ever made in terms of optimization was the inclusion of DirectX 12, because on these Polaris cards and pretty much all AMD cards that are GCN or above, you do get a substantially smoother experience. Once the shaders are done compiling and the game is actually set up and working properly with low and medium settings in 900p, we returned a very smooth and very playable 48 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 40 FPS. And this was taken throughout an entire game of PUBG. I got a bit carried away here and ended up playing for far too long, but even then I was able to get a couple of kills, actually control it and play it fine, and the visuals on display didn't actually look too terrible either. So PUBG works fine provided you're utilising DirectX 12, and generally you can have a pretty decent experience. Is it as good as competing cards? Once again, no. You can definitely buy a lot better card for 30 quid, 40 quid, but at the same time, for an add-in card that can run in any system, it does make the game playable. Next up we have Red Dead Redemption 2, which defaulted to low and medium settings in 900p, so to my knowledge this is sort of around what the original Xbox One sort of uses, you know, the big old VCR units. It's sort of running in that sort of resolution, and with probably similar settings as well. However, rather than a locked and slightly jittery 30 FPS, we returned 37 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 33 FPS, so at least frame rate wise, it was better than the console. Honestly, this wasn't a terrible result. I was expecting to have to run the game in 720p just to get playable frames, but it seemed to know what it was doing here, and I absolutely despise configuring around Red Dead Redemption 2. Maybe I'll do a video on it someday, but for now, low and medium settings in 900p, I'm happy with that. That's how the game defaults itself, and if you are buying an RX550, just put an external 30 FPS cap in place and you'll be having a great time. Then again, you could also buy better cards that can manage this with ultra and high settings for the same money. Next up we have Fallout 4 Anniversary, which of course is a great game to go back and re-benchmark because a lot of people aren't exactly factoring in that if you are playing the latest update, it has had quite a few optimizations that do help out on these cards. So for example, on the RX550 I remember the frame times being all over the place when you were trying to play, of course, Bethesda's latest and greatest at the time, Fallout 4. But thanks to the Anniversary update, as long as you are running the game with low and medium settings, you can manage a 1080p Full HD resolution and actually get a decent 46 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 38 FPS, which is a lot better today than how the game used to run back in the day. So Fallout 4 Anniversary, it's running pretty good, and I'd imagine the 4 gigs of VRAM, which is incredibly overblown here, is definitely helping out to achieve this. When out in the wastelands though, you'd see the game running at nearly a locked 60 FPS, so honestly, I'm going to say pretty good experience, and with low and medium settings, it doesn't look too bad. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, this really is the epitome of what this card stands for. Medium settings, 900p, 40ish FPS, occasionally touching 60 when not much was going on, and hovering just above 30 when lots is happening. Crysis Remastered really has gone to just sum up the card for me. It runs games somewhat okay, the visuals aren't exactly offensive to you, and you'll be getting anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS in simple instances, and you'll be seeing slightly above 30 FPS when lots is going on. So Crysis Remastered actually looked pretty good here. I can't argue with the visuals on display. The fact the RX550, a card that is using about 20 watts right now to deliver these visuals, is delivering these, is really a testament to the Polaris architecture. At the same time though, it is a very well optimized title, and medium settings are quite easy to run. Moving up to high is completely unplayable here, given that is where the game starts to really look fantastic, but also becomes a lot more intensive because of it. So overall performance of the RX550, and the first way I want to look at this is in terms of value. For £30 to £50, which is what people are paying for these, it is not exactly a great performing card. Yes, I know the 750 Ti is expensive for what it is, but performance generally is either on par, slightly better in newer titles, or worse in older titles. Because at the end of the day, you can give it as much VRAM and API support as you want on the RX550, well, it's still a rather just slightly above a display adapter card. And I'm not saying that's anything wrong with it, that is what this tier of graphics card was always meant to be, because when you look at it for what it was an entry-level graphics card that you could buy for 50 quid back in the day, that would play GTA 5 fine, it would play Counter-Strike okay, it would play a lot of games from years after its launch. It's only when you start getting into titles like Cyberpunk, when you start getting into that new one, S&Box, S&Box, however you want to say it, that you start seeing performance that, well, really, it's sub 30 FPS in a 720p resolution or lower. Yes, you have the advantage that FSR works really well here, which has extended the longevity further than I'd imagine AMD originally ever thought it would, but at the end of the day, it is still an RX550. Now, I can understand why some people love these cards, especially some people that are commenting on asking, because they probably bought them for 50 quid on launch and are wondering just how much more can I get out of it. And the thing is, well, as long as you're playing simpler titles, it's okay. If you're playing newer titles, well, it's already met its match, even with the help of FSR, unless it's an incredibly beautifully optimized title like Arc Raiders, it's just not going to manage it because it doesn't have the power to. So, yes, it's not exactly a great performing card. For a low power card, it's fantastic. My only issue is, for the price you're paying, an RX580, an RX480, a 1060, a 980 Ti, probably even a GTX 970 or a 750 Ti are all going to be better options that would cost you either the same or less. Now, I have gone through and done a couple of legacy benchmarks. It's nothing exactly spectacular or, very professionally done, but for a couple of those indie titles that are popular, a couple of those older titles people request to see, and just a few to give you an idea of how this card performs for simpler or older titles. People do quite enjoy this segment, which is why we sort of made it a standard part of the benchmarks for these lower tier cards to say, you know what, newer titles, it's not exactly doing great, well, it's doing okay, but for those older titles, maybe it actually is offering you some solid performance, especially when you consider the form factor and the availability of the graphics card. So how exactly is it doing for legacy and older titles in a very quick segment of the legacy testing benchmarks? Given the incredibly poor performance we saw in S&Box, I decided to run Garry's Mod, because why wouldn't you, it's their previous title and it's still very popular. And it gives you an idea of how it's going to run. I loaded up into a Half-Life 2 map, caused a load of chaos with high settings in 1080p, so the game pretty much maxed out, and we returned 102 FPS on average. We saw 1% lows down to 71 FPS, which overall is pretty solid frame times. I was trying to force a rock into a train, which was proving a struggle for not just the graphics card, but also just the source engine in general. So for Garry's Mod, no problems, and you'll be able to play it fine no matter what PC you put this card into. Next up, I have got the very popular city builder of City Skylines, and I do have to give the card credit here. City Skylines is incredibly VRAM intensive. So given how intensive it is on the VRAM, having 4GB of it here means that you can run the game with high settings in 1080p and achieve a better frame rate than you'd expect. Now, we were running with the FPS fix mod, which is just something that fixes a UI bug, otherwise it's completely unplayable, so make sure if you are playing this game to download the FPS boost mod. I cannot tell you enough. You will not get playable frame rates without it, but if you do have it installed, 37 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 30 FPS, which overall, very solid and very good. Given when this card released, it wasn't Counter-Strike 2 people were playing, it was Counter-Strike Go, so how exactly does it deal with CSGO now that it's back on Steam and is of course very popular? Now of course I did do this in an offline match of Cash, which was a what was it? It was a competitive match where we were running with 1080p and competitive settings, so low everything and high shadows. And the game runs exactly like you'd expect it to for a card from this era. 137 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 101 FPS, and of course you will see very similar results if you go and join an online lobby that's playing a competitive game. So CSGO isn't a problem and never was on the RX550. Not really a legacy title, but given I have recently purchased Masters of Albion, this is Peter Molyneux's new game, the creator of Fable. He's got a new game out, it's sort of like a godlike game, but I have not had any time to actually give it any gameplay. This is the first I've actually had to actually launch it up, and I just want to see how it runs on lower end hardware, and low settings in 480p returned as 23 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 15 FPS. I've not had yet much time to dabble around with this, but yeah, Masters of Albion, not exactly fantastic, but that could be the game, and then again, this is also a title that came out in 2026, running on a budget card from 2017. When you go back to those older Bethesda games like the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, this is the original release of Skyrim, not the Anniversary Edition, not Enhanced Edition, not anything else going on, it is just straight up Skyrim. How does it run? Well, with ultra settings in 1080p, it's pretty much perfect with 54 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 42 FPS. So very much like the synthetic testing led us to believe earlier, when you are moving into these older titles, it does perform a lot like a flagship. So I can understand the appeal of it from that regard, because for these older titles, this is a card hardly pulling 20 watts from the wall, being able to deliver very good visuals and very good frame rates. Given Kerbal Space Program's resurgence in popularity in recent times, I loaded it up with medium settings in 1080p, and of course, I wasn't really under the impression it would do very badly here. On a moon mission, which includes launching everything from the actual spaceship up off the Earth into the moon, and we were absolutely fine. So we saw 102 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 81 FPS. It's also the first time across one of our benchmarks where we've had a somewhat successful landing, and I don't really want to give the RX550 full credit for doing that, but you know what, it was able to do it, maybe it was a factor in there, but for those older Unity or indie titles, the RX550 deals with them absolutely fine. Now I'm going to cover all additional features of the card in sort of one go, because when it comes to power efficiency and thermals, they're really one and the same. The RX550 is an exceptionally efficient card. Now Polaris as an architecture, when it's not pushed to extreme voltages with the rest of the 500 series, well, you end up with a card like this, where when you're gaming, it uses around 20 to 25 watts, and even under a full Furmark stress test, you are looking at around a peak load of 35 watts. Which is one of the reasons this card is popular, because in those power-limited PCI Express lanes, this card will work in them. And I'm assuming that's got to be one of the few reasons why people are buying them, is efficiency is through the roof. Now, as a media card, you do have a few features. You get all the standard AMD features, so for retro gaming it's pretty good. You can force anti-aliasing, EQAA, all the likes like that, and it will work. However, you do also get AMD VCE recording, so I suppose to turn a bit of a standard and basic computer into a bit of a media center, it does also work for that. I mean, the AMD tools of the era they're nothing to write home about, but they do function, and you can get away with a bit of decent recording on it. I fired up Halo Combat Evolved, got a little bit of gameplay using the built-in AMD Relive recorder. You can also do this through OBS and it works absolutely fine, but in terms of extras, the drivers are pretty solid and still getting updated. It's very cool, it's very efficient, and you do get video recording built in. The last thing I did want to talk about though is Linux side usage, because I know I've been comparing it to the 750 Ti. It's a bit of a fair comparison really, because they sell for the same price, and to be fair, in titles of their era, the 750 Ti usually is better, and it's also one of those cards that's quite easy to find in a variant that doesn't need a 6-pin. Anyway, that's besides the point. When it becomes about the RX550 itself, you do get excellent Linux side driver support, which is one big advantage it has over NVIDIA equivalents, and is also something it shares with its bigger brother siblings, like the RX470, RX460, and RX480. I mean, at the end of the day, Polaris is just a refresh of those three cards really, and this weird little cut down RX550 somewhere in the middle. Now, I'm running CatchOS on my main PC. There's a members video if you want to see about how we got that running on here. And the one thing I do have to give it credit for is drivers are seamless and smooth, and we are running the latest version of CatchOS, which has VRAM optimizations. Now, whether or not you still think this is better or worse than Windows really is title dependent, and still the amount of VRAM, because the official reasoning for this update is cards with 8GB of VRAM. When you start getting into cards beneath this, it really is hit or miss whether Windows or Linux is better. I can safely tell you though, that here on the RX550, when I launched up GTA 5 Enhanced Edition with these same settings, it was a smoother experience. Now, our average was pretty much the same, which if anything is admirable for the fact we are running it through a Proton translation layer, but at the same time, our frame rates, well, our frame times, were much tighter, now seeing an average around 36 FPS, with 1% lows down to about 33. Generally, the game could drop slightly further away from 36 FPS when there was lots of foliage on screen as compared to Windows, but if you were looking for a card to use in Linux, especially a little low-profile one or a low-power one, well, the RX550 has all of the Polaris advantages, all of the stable drivers you get through them, just in a much smaller package. So for the Linux experience, it works fine here. So there we have it, AMD's RX550. And what exactly are my thoughts? Well, it's a bit of a weird one, isn't it? Because it is a card of its era. It's a low-power, low-end 2017 card designed for you to walk into any shop or go onto any website and buy for 50 to 60 quid. Or find it in your Dell Inspiron or your Dell Optiplex or your Lenovo SFF PC, and it would get you by for a bit of gaming in that year. AMD has inadvertently extended the life of it through FSR, which it works incredibly well with thanks to its stupidly large amount of VRAM, to the stage where titles of its era just don't touch it. It doesn't change the fact that this card is ultimately not exactly great value. Now, I think the reason people are buying it is because, as I said in that power testing segment, it doesn't use enough power to trip up the BIOS of these OEM motherboards that usually have a 35 or 40 watt limit. So this is one of the most plentiful cards you can get out there that you can just bung into one of those systems and it will just work. So I can understand people paying a premium to be able to turn their current PC into something that will perform like we've shown today. For the average person though that's not running a PC like that, you can very literally buy an RX480 or an RX580 and undervolt them down to 50 to 60 watts of usage. We cover this in the videos I've made on them. And it's literally as simple as dragging a few sliders down to the bottom, and you're still getting 2-3 times the performance of this in a similar power envelope. So I don't hate the RX550, I think it's a decent enough card for what it is. But I do think for the money you're paying, I mean, I've picked up a GTX 970, a GTX 980 recently this week for under 30 quid. I've picked up a 980 Ti for the same price this cost me. And it just makes me think, well, if you're trying to buy for out-and-out power on the market, this is not the card for you. It's an easy card to use with modern drivers and modern support, and that is about all it has going for it. So unless you are buying this for a power-limited BIOS or know what you're getting into, just buy something else, please. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting. I know a lot of people have requested this video, so I've finally gone ahead and done it at the detriment of my own wallet. So thank you all for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and good night.